a rancher helped an Apache woman fix her wagon. After dawn, war paint riders ringed his cabin. Jacob Hale had lived on the edge of the wide Arizona plains for nearly 10 years, and in that time he had learned one simple rule. The land did not care who you were. It did not care if you were kind or cruel, rich or poor. The sun would rise the same, the wind would blow the same, and the dust would cover everything in its path. His cabin stood alone, a small wooden shape, against a sea of grass and stone. Some people said a man had to be lonely to live so far from town, but Jacob did not feel lonely. He felt quiet. The quiet helped him think. It helped him remember who he was and who he wanted to be. That morning began like any other. Jacob woke before the sun, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The sky was pale blue, still holding the last stars of the night. The air was cool, and the smell of dry grass and earth filled his lungs. He liked that smell, It reminded him that the world was still simple out here, even when people made it complicated. He fed his horse, checked the fence near the creek, and planned to ride into town later to trade for supplies. It was going to be an ordinary day. He did not know yet that this would be the day his quiet life would shift, like sand under a strong wind. As he rode along the narrow path near the water, he saw something unusual ahead. A wagon stood crooked near the edge of the creek, one wheel bent and half buried in mud. A woman stood beside it, pushing with all her strength, but the wagon did not move. Jacob slowed his horse and watched from a distance. He had learned to be careful. The land was full of stories, and not all of them ended well. People in town often spoke in low voices about travelers who vanished, about trouble that followed those who asked too many questions or offered help too freely. The woman noticed him. She stopped pushing and stood straight, her hands resting at her sides. She did not wave.
She did not call out. She simply watched him, her face calm but alert.
Jacob felt a small knot form in his stomach. He thought about turning back. He thought about how easy it would be to ride away and pretend he had not seen her. But then he noticed her hands. They were red and scraped, the skin broken in a few places. She had been trying to fix the wagon alone for a long time. He took a slow breath and guided his horse forward. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice gentle. She did not answer right away. Her eyes stayed on him, studying him like she was trying to decide what kind of man he was. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "My wheel is broken," she said. Jacob nodded. "I can see that." They stood there for a moment, the sound of the creek filling the space between them. Birds flew overhead, and the wind moved through the tall grass like a quiet whisper. "My name's Jacob," he said. "I live not far from here." She hesitated, then said, "Nally." He liked the way her name sounded, for it was simple and strong at the same time. Jacob tied his horse to a nearby tree and walked over to the wagon. The wheel was split down the middle, the wood swollen from water and strain. He ran his hand over it, thinking. "This'll take some work," he said. Nally nodded. "I tried," she said, lifting her hands to show him the cuts and dirt. "I can tell," he replied. "But you did more than most would." He went back to his saddle and pulled out a few tools he always carried. Living alone meant learning to fix things yourself, and he rarely traveled without what he needed. He knelt beside the wheel and began to work, careful and patient. Nally stayed close, watching every move. She did not speak much, but Jacob could feel her eyes on him. It did not make him uncomfortable. Desperation. It made him more focused. He wanted to show her that he meant no harm, that he was just a man fixing a broken wheel because it was the right thing to do. As he worked, he asked, "Where are you headed?" She paused before answering. To meet family, far from here. "That's a long road," he said. "Yes," she replied. The sun climbed higher, and the air grew warmer. Sweat ran down Jacob's back, but he kept going. The wheel was stubborn, but he had dealt with stubborn things before. After a while, he leaned back and wiped his hands on his pants. "Try now," he said. Nally put her weight against the wagon and pushed. The wheel rolled forward smooth and steady. A small smile touched her face, just for a moment, before she hit it again. "Thank you," she said. Jacob shrugged. "Just doing what I can." She reached into a small pouch tied to her belt and pulled out a tiny carved bead. It was simple, shaped like a small animal, smooth from being handled many times. She placed it in his hand. "For you," she said. "Show heads." He looked at it, surprised. "You don't have to give me anything." "I want to," she replied. Bray. He closed his fingers around the bead. "Thank you." They stood in silence again, but it felt different now. Easier. The kind of silence that comes after something good has been done. Nolly climbed onto the wagon seat and took the reins. Before she urged the horse forward, she looked back at Jacob. "Be careful," she said. He frowned slightly. "Careful of what?" She did not answer. She only nodded once and guided the wagon down the path, the wheels turning steadily over the dirt. Jacob watched until she disappeared around a bend. The quiet returned, but it did not feel the same as before. He slipped the bead into his pocket and mounted his horse. As he rode back toward his cabin, he kept thinking about her words. "Be careful." They stayed in his mind like a soft echo. The land looked the same as it always had. The sky was wide and clear. The grass moved in the wind. But Jacob felt, deep down, that something had changed. Not around him, but inside him. He reached his cabin and tied his horse. The small wooden building stood in the sun, just as it had every day before. He stepped inside, set his tools on the table, and sat down for a moment. He pulled the bead from his pocket and placed it in front of him. It was a small thing, nothing special to anyone else, but to him it felt heavy with meaning. Jacob did not know why Nolly had warned him. He did not know what her journey would bring, or what his simple act of help might lead to. All he knew was that he had seen someone in need and chosen not to turn away. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin walls like restless fingers. Jacob stood and went to the door, looking out over the open land. Psst. Somewhere out there, Nolly was traveling forward, following her own path. And here he was, standing on his, both of them connected by a single moment beside a broken wagon and a creek that kept flowing, no matter what stories passed along its banks. "Ugh!" He took a deep breath and stepped back inside, not knowing that this quiet day would be one he would remember for the rest of his life. That night, Jacob did not sleep the way he usually did. The small cabin was quiet, but the quiet felt different now. It was no longer peaceful. It felt like the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The wind moved through the cracks in the wooden walls, making soft sounds that reminded him of footsteps. He lay on his bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, thinking about the woman and her warning.
Be careful.
The words repeated in his mind like a slow drumbeat. Jacob told himself he was being foolish. He had helped a traveler. That was all. People passed through these lands every month. Most of them came and went without leaving anything behind but a few tracks in the dirt. Still, something about Nali's eyes stayed with him. She had looked at him like someone who knew more than she was saying. After a while, he gave up on sleep. He sat up and pulled on his boots. Becked. The moonlight spilled through the small window, lighting the room just enough for him to see. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The night air was cool against his skin. The sky was full of stars, bright and sharp, like tiny fires in the dark. The land stretched out in every direction, open and silent. Jacob walked around his cabin, his boots crunching softly on the dry ground. He told himself he was just making sure everything was in place. The fence was fine. The horse was calm. Nothing seemed out of order. But then he saw something near the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but when he stepped closer, he could see the marks in the dirt. They were fresh. Hoof prints. More than one. His heart beat a little faster. He knelt down and touched the ground. The dirt was still loose. These tracks had not been here long. Jacob stood up and looked out into the darkness. He could not see anyone, but he had the strong feeling that he was not alone. He went back inside and closed the door quietly. He did not lock it. There was no lock strong enough to stop trouble if it really wanted to come in. He sat at the small table and waited. Brave time moved slowly. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The sounds of insects and distant animals filled the air. Jacob kept his eyes on the window, watching the stars slowly shift across the sky. Finally, the pale light of morning began to show. The dark blue sky faded into soft gray and then into the light colors of dawn. Jacob stood and opened the door. The world outside looked the same as it always had. The grass glowed with morning light. The air smelled fresh and clean. For a moment, he felt relief. Maybe the tracks were old. Maybe he had imagined the feeling of being watched. Then he saw her. Denali stood near the tree line, just far enough away to keep her distance. She was still and quiet, like she was part of the land itself. Jacob stepped out slowly. "You came back," he said. She nodded once. "I had to," she replied. He could hear the tension in her voice now. It was no longer calm. It was tight, like a rope pulled too far. "Why?" he asked. But she looked past him, toward the open land behind the cabin. "My people are looking for me," she said. "They saw my tracks near your home." Jacob felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. "And they think I had something to do with you disappearing." "Yes," she said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't take you anywhere. You know that." "I know," she replied. "But they don't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the grass, making soft waves across the plain. "What do they want?" Jacob asked. They want to know the truth, she said. And they will come here to find it. Jacob looked around his small cabin, his simple life spread out in front of him. A table, a chair, a bed, a horse, and some land. He had built this place to be away from trouble, not in the middle of it. When? He asked. By soon, she said. As if her words had called them, Jacob heard something in the distance. A low, steady sound. Hooves. Nolly turned her head, listening. Her face grew serious. They are close, she said. Jacob took a slow breath. His hands were steady, but inside his thoughts were racing. He did not want this. He had not asked for it. All he had done was fix a wheel. "What do I do?" he asked. Nally looked at him. Berheb. Be honest, she said. Do not hide. Do not run. The sound grew louder. Jacob could see shapes moving far across the land now. Riders. A group of them, spread out, moving in a wide line. Jacob stepped forward, out into the open space in front of his cabin. He wanted to show that he had nothing to hide. The riders came closer, their horses moving at a steady pace. The ground seemed to shake with every step. Nolly walked to stand beside him. She did not touch him, but she stayed close, like she was drawing a line between him and what was coming. When the riders reached the edge of the clearing, they stopped. Bashan. They formed a wide circle, their horses facing inward. Jacob could feel their eyes on him, measuring him, judging him. The leader moved forward slightly. He was older than the others, his face lined by years of sun and wind. He looked at Jacob, then at Nolly. "Why are you here?" he asked Nolly. "Best." She lifted her chin. "I was traveling," she said. "Boss. My wagon broke. This man helped me and let me go." The leader's eyes returned to Jacob. "Is that true?" Jacob swallowed and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Bet. That's all that happened." The leader studied him for a long moment. The air felt heavy. Bass. Even the wind seemed to pause. Now he reached into her pouch and took out another small bead, like the one she had given Jacob.
She held it up. "This is from my family," she said.
"I gave one to him because he helped me." Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out the bead he still carried. He held it in his open hand so everyone could see. "I didn't know what it meant," he said. "I just knew it was a gift." The leader looked at the bead, then at Nolly. He nodded slowly. The circle of riders did not break, but something changed. The tightness in the air eased just a little. The leader spoke again. "You chose to help a stranger," he said to Jacob. "That is not a small thing." Jacob did not know what to say. He simply stood there, his hands open, his heart still beating fast. After a moment, the leader turned to the others and spoke in a low voice. The riders listened. Then, one by one, they turned their horses away from the cabin. The circle opened. Nally let out a slow breath she had been holding. The leader looked at Jacob one last time. "The land watches what we do," he said. "It remembers." With that, he turned his horse and rode away. The others followed, their shapes growing smaller as they disappeared into the wide open land. The clearing grew quiet again. Jacob felt like his legs might give out. but he stayed standing. He looked at Nolly. "Is it over?" he asked. "For now," she said. They stood there for a while, letting the moment settle. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the ground in their faces. Brasp. "I'm sorry this came to you," Nolly said. Jacob shook his head. "I don't regret helping you." She nodded, like she had expected that answer. After a moment, she turned toward the path that led away from the cabin. "I have to go," she said. He watched as she walked away, her figure growing smaller, just like the riders had. When she was gone, Jacob went back inside his cabin. He sat at the table and placed the bead in front of him again. The quiet returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full of meaning. Jacob knew that, from this day on, he would never look at the land the same way. It was not just a place to live. It was a place where choices stayed behind, long after the people who made them had moved on. The riders were gone, but the feeling they left behind stayed with Jacob like a shadow that did not move with the sun. The land was quiet again, yet it did not feel empty. It felt watchful. Every sound seemed louder now. The wind brushing the grass, the creak of the cabin door, the soft breath of his horse tied near the fence. Jacob stood in the open space for a long time after Nolly had walked away. He told himself to go back inside, to return to the simple things that made up his days. But his feet would not move. His mind kept replaying the moment when the riders had formed a circle around his home. He could still feel the weight of their eyes on him, still hear the leader's words about the land remembering. Finally, he turned and went inside the cabin. The room felt smaller than it had before, like the walls had moved closer together. He sat at the table and rested his elbows on the rough wood. The bead lay in front of him, catching a small line of sunlight from the window. Jacob picked it up and rolled it between his fingers. It was smooth and warm, shaped by careful hands and time. He wondered how long Nolly had carried it before giving it to him. He wondered what it meant to her and what it now meant to him. He stood and placed the bead on a small shelf near the window, where he could see it every day. Then he stepped back and looked around. Everything in the cabin was the same, his chair, his bed, his tools. But he felt like he was standing in a different place than he had been yesterday. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Jacob fed his horse, checked the fence, and walked along the creek. He tried to focus on the work, on the simple tasks that had always kept his mind steady, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Nolly and her people, to the wide circle of riders, to the way the air had felt thick and heavy between them. As the sun climbed higher, he noticed something else. The land itself seemed different, not changed, but alive in a new way. The grass swayed in the wind like it was sharing a quiet story. The birds flew low and fast, calling to one another. Even the creek seemed to move with a stronger sound, as if it was reminding him that time did not stop for anyone. By afternoon, Jacob decided to ride into town. He needed supplies, and he also felt the need to be around other people, to hear voices that were not just his own. He saddled his horse and took one last look at the cabin before heading down the trail. The town was small. Just a handful of buildings gathered around a dusty main road. People moved slowly in the heat, talking in low voices, tipping their hats as Jacob rode past. He tied his horse near the store and went inside. The smell of dry goods and coffee filled the air. The store owner, a round man with a friendly face, looked up and smiled. "You're in earlier than usual," he said. Jacob shrugged. "Figured I'd get it done before the heat got worse." The man nodded and went back to arranging items on the counter. Jacob gathered what he needed: flour, beans, some dried meat. As he waited to pay, he heard two men talking near the door. "Did you hear about the riders out near the creek this morning?" one of them said. Jacob's hand tightened slightly around the bag he was holding. Desperation. "Yeah." The other replied, "Someone said they were looking for a woman, but thought she'd been taken." The first man shook his head. "These lands are getting stranger every year." Jacob paid for his supplies and left the store without saying a word. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, his thoughts heavy. Pay. He knew the story would spread. People would talk. They always did. And with every telling, the truth would stretch and bend, until it barely looked like itself. When he reached the path back to his cabin, the land opened up again, wide and quiet. The sky was clear, the sun bright. It was hard to believe that anything tense or uncertain could exist in a place that looked so calm. But Jacob knew better now. As he rode, he noticed tracks in the dirt along the trail. Not fresh like the ones from the night before, but not old either. Someone else had passed through recently. He did not know who, and he did not know why, but the sight of the tracks made him sit a little straighter in the saddle. He reached his cabin in the late afternoon. The place looked peaceful, just as it always had. He tied his horse and carried the supplies inside. The bead on the shelf caught the sunlight again, and he found himself looking at it without meaning to. Bastard. He cooked a simple meal and ate in silence. The sky outside the window turned gold, then orange, then deep blue. The stars began to appear, one by one. Jacob stepped outside and leaned against the fence, looking up at the sky. He had always loved the stars. They made him feel small in a good way, like his worries were just tiny things in a much bigger world. But tonight, even the stars felt different. They felt closer, like they were watching him as much as he was watching them. He thought about Nally again. He wondered where she was now, if she had reached her family, if she felt safe. He hoped she did. He hoped the path ahead of her was easier than the one behind. As the night grew deeper, Jacob went back inside and lay down on his bed. Sleep came slowly, but it came. He dreamed of the creek, of water moving over stones, of footprints appearing and disappearing in the sand. He dreamed of the bead, shining like a small light in the dark. But when he woke, the cabin was quiet. The light of early morning filtered through the window. For a moment he lay still, listening. There was a sound outside. Not loud, just a soft movement, like someone walking carefully on dry ground. Jacob sat up. His heart began to beat faster, not in fear, but in alertness. He pulled on his boots and stood, moving slowly toward the door. He opened it and stepped outside. The land was calm. The sky was pale with the promise of a new day. His horse stood near the fence, ears forward, watching something just beyond the edge of the clearing. Jacob followed his gaze. Near the same tree line where Nally had stood the day before, a small bundle lay on the ground. Jacob walked toward it, every step careful. When he reached it, he knelt down. The bundle was wrapped in cloth and tied with a thin strip of leather. He untied it and opened the cloth. Inside were simple things: a piece of dried meat, a strip of fresh leather, and another bead, carved in the same shape as the first. Jacob sat back on his heels, holding the bead in his hand. He did not need to be told what it meant. It was a message, quiet and clear. A sign that what he had done had not been forgotten. He stood and looked out over the land. The grass moved in the morning breeze. The creek shone in the early light. Somewhere out there, people were walking their own paths, making their own choices, leaving their own marks on the world. Jacob went back to his cabin and placed the new bead beside the first one on the shelf. They sat there together, small and simple yet full of story. He did not know what the future would bring. He did not know if this moment would be the last ripple from the day he helped a stranger, or just the beginning of something larger. But as he stepped back outside and breathed in the fresh morning air, he felt steady. The land was still wide. The sky was still open. And he was still here, walking his path, one step at a time, carrying with him the quiet reminder that even the smallest act could travel farther than he ever imagined. The days after the bundle appeared were calm on the surface, but inside Jacob something had shifted. He went about his work the same way he always had, mending fences, feeding his horse, checking the creek, but every sound and movement now carried a little more meaning. The land no longer felt like just a place to live. It felt like a place that listened. Each morning he looked at the 2 beads on the shelf before stepping outside. They had become part of his routine, like tying his boots or brushing his horse. They reminded him of the day he had stepped into a story that was not his own, and how that story had reached back to him in quiet ways. One afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared on the far edge of the plain. Jacob shaded his eyes and watched. A rider was coming toward his cabin, slow and steady. His first thought was of the riders from before, and his body grew tense without him meaning it to. But as the figure came closer, he saw it was just one person, riding alone. The rider stopped near the fence and lifted a hand in greeting. Jacob walked forward. It was the older man who had spoken to him in the clearing days earlier, the one who had studied him like a fence post and decided whether he would stand or fall. Jacob nodded. "I didn't expect to see you again." The man looked around at the land, at the cabin, at the horse. "The land brought me back," he said. "Or maybe I brought myself." They stood in silence for a moment. The wind moved between them, soft and steady. "Will you sit?" Jacob asked, gesturing toward the cabin. The man nodded and dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence and followed Jacob inside. The cabin felt smaller with another person in it, but not uncomfortable. Jacob poured water into 2 cups and set them on the table. They sat across from each other, the beads on the shelf catching the light between them. The man noticed them. His eyes rested on the small carvings, and something like recognition passed over his face. "You kept them," he said. "Yes," Jacob replied. "They matter to me." The man nodded slowly. "They matter to us too." Jacob waited, letting the silence do its work. "My name is Tama," the man said at last. I am Nally's uncle." Jacob inclined his head. "I'm glad you came." Tahoma studied him again, but this time the look was softer. "Nally reached her family," he said. "She is safe." Jacob felt a weight he had not realized he was carrying lift from his chest. "I'm glad," he said. "She told them about you," Tahoma continued. Reproach. "About the broken wheel. About the bead." "About how you did not ask for anything." Jacob shrugged. It didn't feel like something worth talking about. Tahoma's lips curved into a small smile. "To some people it is." They sat quietly, drinking water, listening to the wind brush the walls of the cabin. There is a reason I came, Tahoma said after a while. Jacob looked up. What is it? The land is changing, Tahoma said. More people come every year. Bakar. More paths cross. Not all of them cross well. Narration. Jacob thought of the town, of the stories that grew larger with every telling. He thought of the tracks he had seen along the trail. What does that have to do with me? He asked. You stand between paths, he said. You live alone, but you are not apart. Base. People pass near you. Stories pass near you. Jacob frowned slightly. I'm just a rancher. You are a man who chose to help, Tahoma replied. That makes you something more than just a rancher. The words set between them, heavy and light at the same time. I don't want trouble, Jacob said. No one does, Tahoma answered. But sometimes peace needs people to stand for it, even in small ways. Jacob leaned back in his chair, thinking. He had built this life to be simple, to avoid being pulled into other people's stories. And yet, here he was, sitting across from a man whose path had crossed his because of a single choice beside a creek. What are you asking me to do? Jacob asked. Tahoma shook his head. I am not asking. I am telling. You will have moments again where you can turn away or step forward. The land will give you those moments whether you want them or not. Jacob sighed. That doesn't make it sound any easier, Tahoma smiled. It never is. They finished their water. Tahoma stood and walked to the door. He paused there and looked back at Jacob. Nally wanted you to have this, he said. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small bundle, similar to the one Jacob had found that morning. He placed it in Jacob's hands. Rest. Jacob opened it carefully. Inside was a strip of cloth, woven with simple patterns, and another bead, different from the others. This one was shaped like a small circle, smooth and plain. What does it mean? Jacob asked. It means you are part of a story now, Tahoma said, whether you speak it or not. With that, he stepped outside, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into the wide land. Jacob stood in the doorway for a long time after he was gone. The wind touched his face. The sky stretched open above him, endless and quiet. He went back inside and placed the new bead with the others. 3 small shapes on a wooden shelf. 3 moments that had traveled farther than he ever expected. That evening, Jacob rode into town again. He did not know why. Maybe he just wanted to feel the noise of people around him, to remind himself that the world was bigger than his cabin and the land around it. The town was busier than before. A few new wagons stood near the main road. Strangers talked in loud voices, their laughter carrying through the air. But Jacob tied his horse and walked past the store. He overheard pieces of conversation. Did you hear about the rancher near the creek? They say riders came for him. Some say he stood his ground. Jacob kept walking. The story was already changing, growing its own shape. A young boy ran past him chasing a dog. A woman called out from a doorway. Life went on, just as it always did. Jacob bought what he needed and headed back toward his cabin as the sun began to sink. The ride home was quiet. The land glowed in the soft light, the grass turning gold, the shadows stretching long and thin. When he reached the cabin, he dismounted and stood for a moment listening. The world felt steady again, like it had found its balance. That night, Jacob sat outside by a small fire. The flames flickered and danced, throwing light across the ground. He held the newest bead in his hand, turning it slowly. He thought about Tahama's words, about standing between paths, about moments where he would have to choose. He did not feel like a hero. He did not feel like a part of something big. He felt like the same man he had always been, a man who fixed fences. A man who rode into town for supplies, a man who helped someone with a broken wheel. But maybe that was enough. The fire burned low. The stars filled the sky. The land breathed around him, quiet and wide. Jacob stood, brushed the dust from his hands, and went back inside. He placed the bead on the shelf, completing the small line of stories that sat there. He lay down on his bed and closed his eyes. For the first time in days, sleep came easily, and in his dreams he did not see riders or tracks or warnings. He saw a simple thing: a wagon by a creek, a broken wheel, and two people standing in the sun, choosing, in that small moment, to make the world just a little kinder than it had been before. The morning after the quiet night by the fire, Jacob woke with the soft light of sunrise touching the walls of his cabin. For a moment he lay still and listened. The land greeted him the same way it always had, with the gentle sound of wind in the grass and the distant call of birds. It felt steady, like a deep breath after a long pause. He sat up and looked at the small shelf near the window. The 3 beads rested there, catching the early light. Bay. They were simple things, yet they held more meaning than most of what he owned. He did not think of them as gifts anymore. He thought of them as reminders. Jacob pulled on his boots and stepped outside. Bay. The air was cool and fresh, and the sky was clear. The world looked wide and open, full of quiet promise. Best. He walked to the fence and rested his hands on the worn wood, looking out across the land that had become his home. For years he had believed that living alone meant living apart. That, if he kept to himself, the world would pass him by, and he would pass it by in return. But now he understood something different, bearers. Even in quiet places, lives touched each other. Even small choices sent out waves that traveled farther than anyone could see. Pay. He fed his horse and brushed its coat, moving slowly and carefully. The simple task calmed his thoughts. As he worked, he thought about the town, about the stories that were spreading. He knew people would keep talking, shaping his moment into something larger, something louder. He could not control that. What he could control was how he lived from here on. Later that morning, he decided to ride into town one more time, not for supplies, but just to walk among people, to feel the hum of life around him. The ride was peaceful, the path familiar beneath his horse's hooves. When he reached the town, he tied his horse and walked down the main road. The store owner nodded at him. A few people glanced his way and then whispered to each other. Jacob did not let it bother him. He had learned that every person carried their own version of the truth, and there was no point in chasing after all of them. He stopped near the well at the center of town. A small group of children were playing nearby, laughing as they passed a worn ball between them. Their joy was simple and bright, untouched by rumors or stories. Jacob smiled to himself. An older woman approached him, her steps slow but steady. She looked at him with curious eyes. "You're the man from the creek, aren't you?" she asked. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose so." She studied him for a moment. then smiled. My grandson says you're brave. Jacob almost laughed. I don't feel brave. Most people who do the right thing don't, she said gently. Her words stayed with him as she walked away. He stood there for a while, letting the noise of the town wash over him. Then he turned and headed back toward his horse. The ride home felt lighter. The land seemed to open up in front of him, welcoming him back. When he reached his cabin, he dismounted and stood in the doorway, looking inside. The place was simple. A table, a chair, a bed, base, a shelf with 3 small beads. It was not much, but it was enough. Bask. As the day passed, Jacob worked on small repairs around the cabin. He fixed a loose board, tightened a fence post, and cleared a path near the creek. Each task felt like a way of grounding himself, of tying his life to the land in quiet, steady ways. In the late afternoon, he noticed something on the path leading toward his home. A figure was walking slowly, carrying a small bundle. Jacob felt a familiar alertness rise in him, but when the person came closer, he saw it was not someone he knew. It was a traveler, a young man with tired eyes and dust-covered boots. The traveler stopped a few steps away. "Hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "My horse threw a shoe down the road, and I could use some water." He saw no fear in the man's eyes, only weariness.
"You're not bothering me," Jacob said.
"Come on." He led the traveler to the cabin and poured water into a cup. The man drank deeply, letting out a long breath when he finished. "Thank you," he said. "Most folks out here don't stop." Jacob thought of the broken wheel by the creek. Of Nolly's scraped hands. Of the beads on the shelf. "Sometimes stopping is the most important part," he said. The traveler smiled, not fully understanding, but grateful all the same. After resting for a bit, he thanked Jacob again and continued on his way, disappearing down the path. Jacob watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of peace. Bez. He did not know the man's name. He would likely never see him again. But he knew that, for a small moment, their paths had crossed, and something good had come from it. As evening settled in, Jacob sat outside and watched the sky change colors. The sun dipped low, painting the clouds with soft shades of gold and pink. The land glowed, calm and wide. He thought about Nolly, about Tahoma, about the riders in the circle they had formed. He realized that what had stayed with him most was not the tension or the uncertainty. It was the way things had ended, with words instead of anger, with understanding instead of fear. He stood and went inside, lighting a small lamp. The beads on the shelf caught the warm light, casting tiny shadows on the wall. 3 small shapes. 3 moments that had become part of who he was. Jacob reached out and touched the shelf, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood. "I'll remember," he said softly, though no one else was there to hear. That night, he slept deeply. His dreams were quiet and gentle, filled with open land and flowing water, with paths that crossed and then drifted apart again. In the days that followed, life returned to its steady rhythm. Jacob worked, rode into town when he needed to, and spent long evenings watching the stars. The story of the rancher and the riders slowly faded into something people mentioned less and less. New stories took its place, as they always did. But for Jacob, the memory never faded. It lived in the small moments, in the way he looked at travelers on the road, in the way he listened to the land, in the way he chose, again and again, to step forward instead of turning away. One morning, months later, he found a small stone placed near his fence. It was smooth and round, shaped by water over a long time. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but Jacob understood. He picked it up and added it to the shelf beside the beads. Sackrized did not match them, but it belonged with them all the same. The shelf now held a quiet line of reminders. A broken wheel, a warning, a choice, a traveler, becked, a stone shaped by time. Jacob stood back and looked at them, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. He did not know what the future would bring. He did not know whose path would cross his next, but he knew who he wanted to be when it happened. He stepped outside, breathing in the wide open air. The land stretched out before him, full of stories, waiting to be lived. And as he walked forward into another ordinary day, Jacob carried with him the simple truth he had learned beside a creek and a broken wagon, that even in the quietest places, even in the smallest moments, a kind choice could